From Eyewitness News, this is Newsmakers.
The case for tolls. The federal government has told Rhode Island they can't build a toll plaza on the Rhode Island-Connecticut line, at least for now. Meanwhile, the state continues to struggle to maintain its roads and bridges with no new revenue in sight. But is it fair to ask Southern Rhode Islanders to foot much of the bill for the rest of the state? Our guest for the first half of Newsmakers, Director for the Rhode Island Department of Transportation, Michael Lewis. Then,
this is real.
Mayor Angel Taveras says nonprofit institutions like Brown University and the hospitals aren't paying their fair share and must step up to spare the city from bankruptcy. This week, the nonprofit side with our guest, President of the Association of Independent Colleges and Universities of Rhode Island, Daniel Egan. Good morning. Welcome to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. Joining me on the panel, WPRI.com reporter Ted Nesi and political reporter from Rhode Island Public Radio, Ian Donis. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Director. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
Let's start talking about tolls, as we did in the open there. I want to ask you the question that we did right there. Why should residents in the southern part of the state shoulder the burden for our roads and have to be subject to tolls?
Right. Well, I think it's an excellent question. I think it's a debate that's going to have to be had around the state in the General Assembly, and we want to talk it through and to let people know why we're even proposing this. Nobody likes to propose a new revenue, propose a toll, unless there's a real need for it. And I think that's the first and most important thing. There is a need in this state for additional revenues to solve our transportation issues. We are ranked 49th out of the 50 states in investment in road and bridges. 49th out of 50. And there's a reason why the roads and bridges are in the condition they are. It's because they're underinvested. Now, that's not just a Rhode Island problem, it's a national problem. Recently, and many of your listeners will know that we applied with the Federal Highway Administration for the right to toll, or to study the tolling of I-95. Last Friday, I got a call from the Federal Highway Administrator indicating that they had awarded the last available slot under current federal law to North Carolina. So North Carolina is in a similar situation as Rhode Island. They have been awarded the right to put tolls on I-95. Virginia has been awarded the right to put tolls on I-95, and Missouri has been awarded the right to put tolls on I-70. There are only 3 available slots in current federal law. The administrator encouraged us, however, to continue this study because federal law is currently, as we speak, is being debated in Washington. The current bill runs out at the end of March.
The new highway, the federal highway,
the federal highway,
5 years.
That's right, and we're looking. All the states are looking to have greater flexibility at the state level, so that decision can be made at a local level.
I have a million questions based off the answer, but I need you to get back to the original question, Director, which is why should Southern Rhode Islanders foot the bill?
We don't do this as Southern Rhode Islanders footing the bill. Again, we have a comprehensive plan, not only tolling.
They do.
Not only tolling, and I'll address that, Tim. Not only tolling in the East Bay, because there's an issue with regard to maintaining the 4 very expensive bridge assets in the East Bay, but also the interstate corridor. Now, in the southern part of the state, and we're looking at a location that would be around Exit 3, greater than 60% of the traffic on the interstate at Exit 3 is out-of-state traffic. 60% of passenger vehicles. Over 80% of commercial vehicles are out-of-state drivers. So that's really what we're trying to capture. We're trying to capture the people that are coming through Rhode Island from outside of the state and are passing through the state and not investing in our infrastructure at all. When we leave the state, when we go to New Hampshire, or we go to Maine, or we go to New York or DC, we are paying tolls on all of those highways. We are investing in those states to help in their maintenance. And we're not asking anybody from outside of the state to help invest in ours. Now, with regard to the southern part of the state and people that would be affected, we need to work with them because we need to look at what are alternate routes. Are there other opportunities that if somebody commuting from the southern part, from Westerly or somewhere in the southern part, is coming up to the capital city, are there other routes so they can avoid the toll? So that's an issue that needs to be addressed. The toll rate needs to be addressed.
But are there other routes to avoid the toll? Do you know the answer?
The Route 3 is a very high capacity roadway that was the main road before I-95 was built. So there are opportunities to bypass the interstate.
So why wouldn't people from Connecticut use Route 3 and bypass the toll?
One of the reasons is that the reason that we've identified the southern part of the state is because you've got miles between each of the interchanges. And in general, and again, this is true on the entire I-95 corridor, people are paying tolls in all other states, you generally don't jump off of the interstate in order to avoid a toll, unless the toll is too high. And that becomes a question of how high a toll you would put in place, because you obviously don't want to encourage people to leave. You don't want to encourage people to use the local roads.
Director, people are going to hear you say, I know everyone's seen those numbers, we're 49th in transportation funding, but we are not 49th in terms of the size of our state budget. Has your department ever looked at, do we put a smaller share of the state budget toward, maybe it's a question of priorities?
We do. We have I'm not sure about on a percentage basis, but we have one source of revenue in this state for all transportation spending, and that is the state gas tax. And that 2/3 of the state gas tax, is about 33 cents a gallon, goes to RIDOT for operations. 1/3 goes to RIPTA for their operations. Most states have a much broader revenue stream for transportation. Most states, the registry fees, the licensing fees, goes to a transportation trust fund. Many states have a portion of the sales tax goes to transportation for purchases of automotive-related
So it's partly
products.
just we're putting more straight into the general fund, where other states have said we're going to spend this on transit.
That's right. And when we talk about tolls, I mean, the state of New Hampshire, similar size state, they take in $116 million a year in toll revenues. And we take...
Would that be a lot? Would that be helpful to you to get that much money?
It's huge. Our total budget, our total state budget from the gas tax is under $90 million a year.
Director, we often hear about the sorry state of roads and bridges in Rhode Island. One example, your department recently closed 2 relatively small bridges in the Rumford section of East Providence. DOT said it would take about 2 years to replace these relatively small bridges. A lot of people scratch their head and say, why does it take so long to make these types of corrections? A lot of people remember the almost about decade-long effort to replace the Barrington Warren Bridge.
Right.
So what do you say to that?
Well, I think it's an excellent question. I think we're looking at ways through accelerated bridge construction techniques, to change that, to get off of the poster child Barrington Bridge that everybody has the image of. We did a bridge replacement up in Burrowville last year, which took 41 days. The road was closed. 41 days later, the new bridge was in place.
What made that happen that doesn't usually
happen?
happen?
Of the problem, well, you structure the contract in such a way that it encourages the contractor to do that. In the East Providence area, it's actually 2 bridges, and there are environmental issues because it's a androgynous fish run that you can't be in the water for a period of time because of the fish. So there are in some cases there are environmental reasons why you can't do that. We are advertising a contract this summer to replace the 114 Wampanoag Trail Bridge over Warren Avenue, and we're going to do it in a weekend. We're going to, in the summer of 2013, we're going to have the bridge demolished and the new bridge put in place over the course of 1 weekend. And those are the kind of techniques that we are introducing to address exactly what you're getting at, Ian, because we agree with you.
To come back to the toll issue, how soon might the state reasonably get permission from the federal government to add tolls on I-95?
That's a difficult question, but here's what's happening. As I said earlier, the current federal authorization, the federal bill, expires March 31st. What the new bill will contain with regard to tolling is still under debate. We are pressing, we here in Rhode Island, we across the country from the states are pressing for greater flexibility in that new bill. We'll see what comes out of that. If there's greater flexibility, we're going to continue on a path of having a local discussion. Again, we want this to be a local decision. This is a decision made within the state. If the other thing that was pointed out in the administrator's letter to me of last week, the 3 approved projects in Missouri, Virginia, and now North Carolina, they don't have an unlimited period of time to actually implement. So if one of those states determines that at a local level we're not going to toll, then we are still in the running.
You know, about those other states, we had the Secretary of Transportation, Ray LaHood, on this program. He was crystal clear. I'm sure you saw it because you're a big viewer of Newsmakers, right?
Absolutely, every day.
He said, I'm not a fan of it. If you're not adding capacity, it's not going to happen. And I know in your application you tried to go through a pilot program and get around it. Did those other states have an application where they added capacity?
Missouri is not an added capacity state. It's a reconstruction, very much like ours, because it's I-70 across the whole state. Virginia, I'm not sure. North Carolina does have a component of their plan which adds lanes to the interstate, so it was capacity.
Will it help your cause if Secretary LaHood leaves?
Secretary LaHood's going to be here next week, and he and I are going to be talking about the viaduct together. So in current federal law, it allows for capacity and for rehabilitation or reconstruction of bridges on the interstate. So it's there, it's allowable in the federal law, but that's almost moot now because that federal law is expiring. It's really what matters is what's in the new federal law. And if there was another way, I've often said, the only thing worse than tolling maybe is not tolling. Because if we can't find the revenue stream, then the roads and bridges in the state are going to continue to deteriorate, they're going to get worse, and that is going to have a long-range negative economic impact on the state.
Well, you gave me a good segue there because I wanted to ask about the viaduct. That's, for people who don't know, it's the large bridge that carries I-95 over
right behind
Providence
the mall.
Next to the mall.
Right.
And I've noticed more and more focus on that. The tolling money partly would go to pay for that. Senator Whitehouse and Senator Reid are looking at ways to get federal money for that. I just want to understand, how concerned are you about the Providence Viaduct Bridge and maybe having to limit traffic or something? That would have a huge impact.
Very concerned. That is my number one, the number one piece of infrastructure in this state that I worry about is that bridge. Not because it's unsafe today. It's safe. We always ensure it's regularly inspected to ensure that it remains safe. But it is at the end of its service life. We are constantly having to cobble it together. We've repaired the steel. There are cracks in the structural steel that had been repaired. Back in the 80s, one of those girders cracked wide open where the bridge had to be shut down while there was an emergency repair done. That bridge needs to be replaced. At a value, its estimated cost of about $150 million, that's probably as much as we would have available for all of the state in a particular year. So we know we have to do that one, and if we don't have another source of revenue, we're proposing that the tolling would be the source of revenue. If we don't have that, it's going to have to come out of the regular program, which means there won't be another.
How long can you cobble that together? I mean, I'm just imagining, if you had to say trucks couldn't go along with the viaduct the way you did in Pawtucket, that would have a massive impact.
Huge impact, and huge economic impact. We don't have a good detour alternative for the viaduct. That's why it's under design now. It's going to be ready to be replaced in 2014. We have to identify the money. If we can't find a new source of revenue, we're going to have to use our existing source of revenue. And if we use our existing source of revenue, there's not going to be very much left to do anything else. It's a must-do.
Director, Mother Nature apparently get your memo. There's been very little snow.
And we're very appreciative.
Yes. I have two quick questions on that one. How is the snow removal budget now, and if there is a surplus, if we don't have a busy March, although we're overdue? Do you get to hold on to that money, or do you throw it back into the state general?
The short answer to that is there's no surplus because we were working off a deficit.
Okay. Well,
so
there you go.
this budget had a built-in $12 million deficit. This year's budget, $12 million deficit.
You mean the RIDOT budget?
The RIDOT budget was authorized to spend $12 million more than the revenues could do. So what's so important that we had the winter that we did is that what started out as a $12 million deficit is now a $2.5 million deficit. So the bad news is there's nothing left, there's nothing there for next year. The good news is it could have been a lot worse.
There was still some spending, according to records provided by your office, and provided them quickly. We always like to highlight transparency on the show. The state spent almost $200 grand on the storm that wasn't. That was the February 11th storm. The forecasts were 6 inches, and it really just petered out. But I'll tell you the number that stuck out to me. $42,000 was spent on outside vendors. Why would you use outside vendors when there's no snow on the ground? You have state personnel. You spent 35 grand on them, 90 grand on materials, so salt and sand, I'm assuming, on that. Why go to outside vendors?
Well, that's a good question, Tim. The way we're structured, we aren't staffed at RIDOT to handle all of the roads in the state. We have somewhere between 90 and 100 pieces of equipment that are out there on the roads. On a typical storm, we use between 300 and 400 pieces of equipment to handle all the roads that we have, and that is the outside vendors is what we rely on. So we don't have the state staff to cover all the roads, and when a storm is projected to come, we have to do pre-treatment first. So we have to go out and put salt on all of the roads to ensure that when it starts to snow, the snow doesn't stick. So a predicted storm, we do the pre-work, the pre-treatment, and that's where those costs are incurred. Now, if it doesn't snow the way it was projected, then we don't incur the additional costs because we send the vendors home.
There was no feeling on your part that the trigger was pulled too early on that storm?
No.
Okay.
I think that's always a question, but all people have to do is remember back to December 13th
was it December 7th? Yeah.
And you have to be ready. And so as much as that's $200,000, it's relatively short dollars to make sure that we don't have that kind of problems. Because once you get behind, you can't catch up.
Speaking of revenue, we see how gas is climbing toward $4 a gallon at the pump. Is that resulting in less gas tax revenue for the state? And do these high gas prices point to you the need for a different kind of approach toward transit?
I think yes, yes, and yes. The additional gas prices, one of the things that does it drives people to drive less. And of course, as people drive less, the state takes in less revenue. So as prices go up, we actually take in less revenue. And so does RIPTA take in less revenue. So as people are shifting to transit because of gas prices, we're getting less money to pay to RIPTA to cover those new people coming to transit. So that's why, on a national level, the continued reliance solely on a gas tax is not working and won't be working for the future. And that is true here in Rhode Island as well.
DOT Director Michael Lewis, thank you very much for joining us on the program. When we come back, nonprofits in Providence, we have the president of the Colleges Association in Rhode Island, Daniel Egan. Stay with us. You're watching Newsmakers. Welcome back to Newsmakers. I'm Tim White. To my right, Ted Nisi and Ian Donis. And for our second half, we welcome Daniel Egan, long title. I'm only going to do this once. President of the Association of Independent Colleges and Universities of Rhode Island. You must have a massive business card.
It's about that big.
Before we get to the question, I want to mention that we asked the Rhode Island Hospital Association to send a representative to give their side of the story on this, but they said they had no one available for our Friday morning taping. Ted.
Let's just go right to it, Dan. Where do things stand between Brown and the city of Providence right now?
Well, I think, the mayor's been pretty clear and open about his optimism around their discussions. I'm representing Brown and the 7 other schools in the state. I'm not privy to that exact direct conversation, but I've had numerous conversations with the institution and their representatives, and I think they're encouraged about the opportunity that the mayor's presented. We're encouraged.
Encouraged about the opportunity the mayor's presented to hand him money? They're encouraged by that?
Well, but I don't think it's about handing money. Our association has been pretty clear up front about what our expectations were in response to the mayor's request, and that was simply he had an opportunity around the 195 land, for lack of a better term, to monetize that. Legislative authority given both on the 195 Commission requires a memorandum of agreement between any institution, a nonprofit institution interested in purchasing land or expanding into that area. So we have, from the get-go of this conversation, have said let's use that opportunity to expand beyond what we already do as institutions. As you know, the Memo of Understanding in 2003, signed by the 4 institutions, and then Mayor David Cicilline outlined a $50 million gift over 20 years. Our membership is very, very concerned about the security of that agreement. It was highlighted at the time as large. It was highlighted as long-term. It checks all of the boxes that were created by the recent Revenue Commission in terms of a rubric that's needed for an appropriate partnership with a nonprofit and a host community. So we think that the 195 is an important way, an important first step. So we do see it as an opportunity, and it is transactional. It is about purchasing property, expanding, and growth around 2 major institutions that are at the backbone of Providence's economy.
With that 2003 deal, I'm going to guess that where you live, your property taxes have gone up since 2003. So why shouldn't colleges and universities also see an increase in their contribution?
Well, my taxes have gone up, albeit slightly because I'm in a good organization, a good community. But there is a slight inflator in that agreement. So there is an increase over the time.
Can you say that inflator is clearly not enough, or do you think it was enough?
It depends on your perspective. If you think that the nonprofits should be contributing directly to the city. And as tax exempts, and that's one of the interesting things for us, Tim, is that we're at the table. We've been at the table since '03. We're the only tax-exempt sector. The tax-exempt sector of higher education, and that would be the 8 private colleges. Is
Providence College at that table?
Providence College, as a member, I represent Providence College. In this conversation with the mayor, I represent Providence College.
Did you see Newsmakers last week with the mayor?
I did.
Okay. He had a very uncomfortable. He had an uncomfortable moment when I asked him about Providence College. He was silent for a few seconds, and reading into it, it doesn't seem like Providence College has a lot of interest in coming in, stepping up. Have you talked to Father Shanley?
I've had numerous conversations with Father Shanley.
And the answer is?
They do. They've given $250,000 a year annually for 8 years.
And the mayor wants more.
Right.
And the answer to that the response to that is there's an opportunity 195, and then others need to participate as well. We're the sector that has stepped up We're the sector that's come out.
Let's be clear what we're saying here. We're talking about the hospitals, and as Tim said, we asked the hospitals to send someone. They couldn't this morning, although you used to work for the hospitals as well,
Full disclosure,
right?
7 years representing the hospital
Right.
district.
So, I mean, is there, I don't know if it's a bitterness or what you'd say, but from the college's end, the colleges did step up in 2003. The hospitals, they always said uncompensated care, but they still don't contribute a dollar to the city budget, unlike their peers in Boston. I mean, is that frustrating to the colleges?
I don't think it's frustrating about one sector, and we all turn to that one sector because they're the most similar one to us. But I've had numerous conversations, whether it be Father Healy in the diocese, whether it be Mary Kim Arnold who runs the humanities, that the whole entire nonprofit conversation needs to be had. And the state did have that conversation. Gary Sass, when he was with the administration, ran a discussion, and it was kind of too problematic to move forward. But we're clearly at a point in public policy where the nonprofit taxation conversation has to take place beyond just one sector deciding to be a partner in a way that's a cash transaction.
In an ad hoc way.
I'd like to follow up on Ted's question by asking about some of the big compensation that George Vecchione received from Lifespan. He got a $9 million package 1 year. A more normal salary for him was $3 million. Doesn't that give the lie to the line from the hospitals that they don't have extra money to help the city of Providence?
Well, I'm going to have to ask Ed Quinlan for a bonus this week, even though I no longer work for him. So it's difficult for me to...
Ed Quinlan of the Hospital Association,
I'm sorry.
mention that. Yeah.
It's difficult for me to respond because I don't represent Mr. Vecchione of the hospitals no longer, but...
You know, just from the street level view of people in Providence, what should they think? I mean, doesn't that show that these medical institutions have some extra money that could help Providence?
Well, I think it gets back to the bigger point about not only hospitals, not only colleges. There's a tax-exempt policy that this country and this state has followed for decades and centuries. In fact, you know, I think one of my presidents, or I won't say who it is, but others have said Genghis Khan didn't tax hospitals and colleges. So why are we at a point where our social service network, our community network, our educational network, our institutions were founded and are not-for-profits for a reason. Some were for-profits, as we've heard through the dialogue at the State House recently, 50 years ago. And they were formed and encouraged to be not-for-profits, and the benefits and the struggles and the, let's say, the regulation that comes with being a not-profit put upon them or accepted by them to be that net for education.
But if a CEO of a Rhode Island hospital network is getting a richer compensation package than his counterparts in Massachusetts, what does that say?
I think you'd have to ask Lifespan that question.
Let me ask you, you mentioned profit there. Newmont University, taking it off the Providence question for a minute, a for-profit school wants the General Assembly to pass a law allowing it to operate in Rhode Island. That would presumably compete with you guys. What does your institution think about that?
Our membership is opposed to the expansion of the opening of the door to for-profits.
They charge a lot of money. Brown's up to 55 grand.
We've had success in Rhode Island with the model we have. We have 11 institutions, 8 represented by the independent sector, 3 represented by the public sector. And in 1980, the General Assembly kind of locked the door to for-profits. If you look at what Senator Whitehouse and his committee, the Help Committee in Congress and the Senate is looking at right now, and the messages they're sending to us on costs, and the message they're sending to the for-profit sector, for Rhode Island to change nearly 30 years of a policy for one small institution is troublesome.
What about access, though? The question of who can get in and whether people can afford it. You know, maybe we need to let 1,000 flowers bloom in the higher ed sector. I mean, $55,000, that's Brown, is a lot of money. Even what URI is charging now is a lot of money for an in-state student.
They don't disagree with the cost, but we would also argue the value. But the reality is allowing the institution in to a sector that doesn't have the STEM pipeline. Degrees that we give out are 600 in total to the 100 they promised to give in. And the reality is the STEM students coming out of high school...
STEM, we got to help
I'm sorry, you told me no acronym. Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, and also STEAM. We add the word art because RISD's a member of our organization. So the STEAM opportunities, there aren't the students coming through the pipeline to fill that spot. So you're really not opening 1,000 new flowers. You're just repotting them and resoiling them somewhere else.
Bringing competition for your members.
I guess the competition is a healthy thing. It's not a dirty word to us, but the reality is there's a reason for that exemption. And we looked the last time we allowed 1,000 flowers to bloom with Katie Gibbs in Cranston. It was around a land deal. It was about filling a lease, similar to what the Newmont reality will be, although they argue in economic development. It's really a lease fulfiller and a transition of jobs. It was done around that, and quite frankly, they were monetized, or I should say liquidated 4 times. They were unable to reach the ASC accreditation. So in the last 10 years, we have an example of how it's not worked in Rhode Island, and we think that's a cautionary tale that the General Assembly should consider. And I have a conversation scheduled for next week, the Majority Leader, on just this issue.
Dan, we have about 1 minute left, a little less. There's a school of thought that Providence should just file for bankruptcy to, hit the master reset and get its books in order. What do you think? Should Providence just pull that trigger?
Yeah, I wouldn't to begin to think or tell the mayor what to do. I think the mayor needs to really think about what his opportunities are. If that's an opportunity to reset the lever, I think what our membership is concerned about, and I said this prior, is this is a short-term conversation that we've really talked about, is getting through this budget year. July 1 begins another conversation, and it's probably a 2 to 3, maybe decade-long conversation, and that's where we want to be at the table, is kind of how do we help him, the mayor, Tavares, and the administration get this state in a place where we can all be successful.
All right, Dan Egan from the Rhode Island Independent Colleges and Universities Association, thank you so much for joining us. And
thank you, Tom.
I do want to thank our first half guest, Michael Lewis, Director of the Rhode Island Department of Transportation. If you missed any of the program, you can always watch it online, WPRI.com. It's under the on-air section. For Ted Nisi and Ian Donis, I'm Tim White. We'll see you next week on Newsmakers.